good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this webinar on child labor due diligence. I'm Alice Harbach-Forel. I head the programs at the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein, the local chapter of the UN Global Compact Initiative. The objective of our network is to draw the attention of companies to the relevance of social and environmental issues for their activities and to support them in the implementation of responsible business practices along the 10 principles. I'm your host today because we have been mandated by the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs to organize a webinar series on child labor due diligence with the aim to support and guide companies in the implementation of the child labor due diligence process. We also want to promote the exchange of experience and good practices. So first of all, I would like to thank SECO for the trust and for the pleasant collaboration. As you see on the slide, the webinar series is composed of 4 webinars. Today, it's the second webinar of the series, and the series will run until the end of June. You have the possibility to upload the recordings of the past webinar and register for the upcoming ones on our website. Today, we will focus on the first steps of a child labor due diligence, namely the policy commitment and the identification of child labor risks and impacts along the value chain. The agenda will look as follows. We will start with Regula Meng and Dominic Riedman from Focusrite, who will tell us what the ILO-IOE child labor guidance tool recommends to do to start the due diligence process on child labor. We will then hear from Serena Alonso how Dormakaba implements those recommendations in practice. Dorothee Baumann-Pauli and Berit Knag from the Center for Business and Human Rights at the University of Geneva will then explain why zero tolerance policies don't work and what unintended consequences they have on the issue of child labor. They will be followed by Sandra Groth from Save the Children, who will show us which elements must appear in a holistic child rights policy. Finally, we will hear from Marlene Liert from the Center for Child Rights and Business how to conduct a proper child rights risk assessment and impact assessment on the ground. I would like to thank all the speakers for their time and dedication already. And before I hand over to Regula, I would like to quickly show our housekeeping rules. So please note that the session is recorded and that recording and slides will be sent out to you by email in the upcoming days. Please write your questions in the chat, remain muted as long as you don't speak, and we will have time to answer the questions at the end of the webinar. Regula, I invite you to share your screen and I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alice, for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. So thanks for the invitation to Focusrite to be part of this webinar. It's really great to see that the topic attracts so much attention. So my name is Regula Meng. I'm a consultant at Focusrite, and I'm here today with my colleague Dominic Riedman to tell you a bit more about how to use this ILO-IOE child labor guidance tool and how to kind of set up the basic framework for child labor due diligence. So for those of you who were not part of the first webinar, here also a small recap of how to use this guidance tool and how it relates to the UN guiding principles. So basically one of the objectives is to really understand how they relate to each other. And basically what the guidance tool does, it explains what the UNGP expectations are to companies with regards to the actions the company need to take to address child labor impacts. So it is relevant for companies that are already applying the UN guiding principles, as well as for companies that are not yet applying the UN guiding principles, and it kind of explains what the implications of these guiding principles are for the company efforts to prevent and address child labor risks. So basically the tool supports companies at different stages of the process. So first, for example, when companies are looking to kind of assess their child labor risks and impacts, it helps the company to know whether child labor really is a significant risk for the company. It gives a bit of background about the nature of child labor impacts. It kind of explains where exactly along the value chain this can occur and how companies can assess their child labor risks. Then the second point is that the tool also supports companies that want to understand a bit better what the UNGPs say, what are the requirements with how to address child labor. So it's really about understanding a bit more what are the expectations of businesses and what is also maybe the role of the government and how these two different roles relate to each other. And then the third point, and I think that's really important and practical point, it also provides some guidance to companies that are currently trying to self-assess or evaluate where the efforts that they're already doing with regards to child labor, where they stand with regards to these expectations in the UNGP. And the whole section C of the guidance tool is really dedicated to this part. So it has a list of diagnostic questions that are really useful for companies to kind of evaluate where they currently stand. So I think most of you have seen maybe this or a similar graph of human rights due diligence, or also in this case, a child labor perspective on the topic of due diligence. And we know that is kind of a continuous management process that consists of various steps. So it's about adopting a policy commitment, about analyzing the risks and the impacts that the company may cause or contribute to or be linked to, taking measures to address the risks that have been identified, to embed human rights related topics and child labor into the company, to track the efforts that a company is taking with regards to child labor, to communicate it, and to provide access to grievance and remedy for affected people. So in today's webinar, we'll focus on the first two elements of this due diligence process, and we'll address the rest of the elements in the upcoming webinars. So to kind of go a bit more in detail of how exactly company can adopt a policy commitment and how it can do a risk analysis, we have invited a special guest from a fictive company to discuss it a bit more in detail. Dominic, you are the sustainability officer of the fictive Swiss retail company. Please briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Regula. We're a Bern-based retail company, mostly active in Switzerland, and we have around 9,000 employees worldwide, of which the majority is located in Switzerland. We have products in food, personal care, textiles, and electronics sector with a total of approximately 12,000 products. We sell own brand and international brand products, and our own brand products are mostly produced in our own factories in Switzerland and Germany, but as well in factories from in factories of our suppliers, mainly in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and China.
So Dominic, you told me that your company is now evaluating how to proceed with the policy commitment following this child labor guidance tool. So what challenges are you currently facing?
Yeah, it's true. So we have already several policies in place, including a sustainability policy, which also covers some social aspects. But now, to be honest, it's not really clear how to proceed. So does our sustainability policy already fulfill these requirements of the ILO, IOE guidance with regards to child labor? Maybe you could help us with that.
Yeah, so basically that's possible that it already fulfills the requirement. It really depends what the exact content, what the format of adoption of your sustainability policy was, because according to the UNGPs and the guidance tool, the company is basically expected to make a public commitment to respect internationally recognized human rights, including the right to be free from child labor. So there needs to be some kind of explicit commitment to people's human rights, children's human rights, to be free from child labor. And then this policy commitment needs to be embedded and implemented throughout the organization. And the policy commitment really can take various forms. So in line with the UNGPs and the child labor tool, it's perfectly possible, for example, that it takes the form of a broad sustainability commitment. For example, especially if this covers human rights and makes explicit reference to child labor. And for most companies, it will probably make sense to kind of adopt a broader human rights commitment, which also includes child labor, because your company will likely have risk related to a series of different human rights. So you would ideally adopt a broader policy commitment that kind of covers all of your salient risk with regards to human rights. And then it really depends if your company works in an industry where there is significant risks with regards to child labor, and the higher the risk with regards to child labor are, the more it's also recommended that you kind of develop a more specific in-depth policy or statement with regards to child labor, in addition to, you know, the more general policy. So,
okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So I get that the form of our policy seems to meet the requirements, but what about the content? So how can we evaluate in more detail if our policy is in line with the ILO IOE guidance?
Yeah, so to evaluate that, what I would recommend for you is to really go have a close look at section C1 of the guide and really go into depth into these diagnostic questions, because they're kind of the list of this question will really guide you step by step through the detailed requirements of how you should implement that. And this will allow you to kind of evaluate the status and also to identify the gaps. So for example, here with regards to the content, that you mentioned that you were wondering. So one of the requirements for the content is that the commitment makes reference to these international standards, so the International Bill of Human Rights and or the ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. So you can really go through this checklist and self-evaluate the content and the different elements according to these diagnostic questions.
Okay, so there is a checklist in this guidance tool. That's very helpful.
So then the next step of the due diligence process is to really assess the child labor risks. So to kind of find out where the risk and the hotspot along the value chain are. Where does the company currently stand with regards to this second step of the risk assessment?
I mean, we are already taking some measures to identify child labor. So for example, through the use of audits and certification schemes. So in that sense, I would say we already have risk assessment in place. What would you say?
So we typically consider the sustainability certifications more of a risk-based measure and not a risk assessment. So it would be here, you know, on step 3 of the core elements. And this is because there's some requirements of how a risk assessment needs to be conducted in line with the UNGPs and the guidance tool, the child labor guidance tool, that the certificates, or to be more specific, the audits that are part of these certificates, they typically do not fulfill. So, for example, according to the UN guiding principles and the guidance tool, the company is expected to really know what the child labor impacts could be or are. So that means that you need to implement a risk assessment as an ongoing activity, because when maybe you change part of your value chain, your business partner, the context changes, and also your risk might change. So it's important to have kind of this ongoing risk assessment process. And then also there needs to be kind of a systematic assessment that really covers your own operation, covers your business relationships along the full value chain. And here again, the risk assessment can take various forms. So for example, it can be integrated, the child labor risk assessment can be integrated in kind of into a broader human rights assessment that covers, as one of several topics that it looks at, covers also child labor. Or it can be more a focused assessment where it's really, for example, a child rights assessment, looking at child rights in general, including child labor, or even a child labor only assessment. And I think here it really depends how mature the company is with regards to the implementation of due diligence. You would usually start with a more high-level human rights assessment to kind of identify your salient risks and then go deeper from there.
Okay, this sounds quite abstract to me, to be honest. What would your recommendation be? What's the first step for our company? How can we start?
So to start and to get started kind of with this risk assessment process, we recommend that you start with a high-level mapping of the full value chain. So really, this is an example of an agricultural value chain. So for example, for food products, really start from the production of raw materials, in this case, agricultural production, through the different processing steps, the processing production of food products, the transport along the value chain, the sales of the product, the consumption phase, and the end of life phase. And once you kind of have mapped, and of course this is very simplified, right? Because a real value chain is very complex. And so you kind of simplify the value chain, you map what the most important steps are. And once you know what the key activities are at each of these steps, who the most important actors are that are involved in these steps, and maybe even where the most important geographies are where these activities take place, then you can also, based on this knowledge, you can do your research to find out what the possible child labor risks are at each step of the value chain.
Okay, but this sounds realistic for if you have a handful of products in your company, but we have 12,000 products from all over the world. I mean, there may be thousands of potential child labor risks. How can we make this practicable?
Yeah, I mean, the complexity of the value chain is a really big challenge that a lot of companies are facing. And here the good news is that due diligence is really an ongoing process. So it allows for continuous improvement. You are allowed to start at one point and it will not be perfect at first, and then, continuously deepen and improve the risk assessment. So even if you have a lot of different products, you might find a level of abstraction for that really first overarching risk analysis that is relevant for a lot of your products, or maybe even for all of your products. And what's also important to know is that you are allowed to prioritize the areas of the value chain where the risk for child labor is greatest. So kind of to identify the hotspots along the value chain. And the UNGPs and the child labor guidance tool, it gives you the criteria according to which you can do this prioritization. What's important is that you need to take the perspective of risk to people. So you can ask the question of where the impact of child labor are most severe for the potentially affected people.
Okay, so you recommend to really focus on the most severe risks.
Yes, exactly. And as we have heard in the first webinar, the worst violations in terms of child labor, they typically happen further up the value chain. So it might not be with your direct or tier 1 suppliers, but it might be further up, it might be at some stages of processing or even raw material production. So to be able to find out where the most severe risks are, you'll need to have some sort of mapping and high-level risk assessments in place. And then from this overview, you can then zoom in. And this also explains why the use of audits might not amount to risk assessment in this sense, because the audits might typically cover maybe 1 or 2 stages of the value chain, and it doesn't give you the full picture of your value chain. And what you can do as a second step, once you have this overview, is to really conduct a more detailed assessment and zoom in the areas where you have identified that the risk and impacts, they might be particularly severe.
Okay, I have one final question about stakeholder engagement. We always hear that stakeholder engagement is a very important part of human rights due diligence or child labor due diligence. But to us, to be honest, it's not always clear for what steps of the process and also how we can do that. How can we engage with stakeholders? So maybe you could give me some examples for this.
Yes, so with regards to the policy commitment, a couple of examples of which stakeholders you could engage and how you could do that is, for example, when you are in the process of adopting or reviewing your policy commitment, you could, for example, consult with your industry peers to find out about their learnings and experiences to kind of make use of the lessons that they have already been through. You could also seek inputs from experts. So either, for example, experts on child labor, external experts from civil society organizations, or also internal experts that kind of know very well what your value chain looks like, the risks may look like, and can give you some guidance on how to formulate a policy that is effective. And then, of course, once the policy is adapted, you can use it as a tool, to discuss these issues with your supplier and use it kind of as a reference in your engagement with business partners. And then with regards to the risk and impact assessments, of course, stakeholder engagement is really important, because ideally, once you kind of did, this high level assessment, you would also get a bit more in detail, and ideally also start consulting potentially affected people or the representatives of these potentially affected people, and really have also meaningful consultations, for example, in a more in-depth child labor risk assessment. Here, one option is also to engage with the local national governmental actors. So we have heard that, of course, the role of governments is important when we speak about addressing child labor risks. So this is also one counterpart or stakeholder that would be important, to engage with. And again, issue experts as well. So when you try to find out what might be important risks for your company here, it would also be important to speak with people who really know about the issues, know where you can find it, and maybe can also kind of help you to find for your specific industry and value chain where might be the most important risks for the people involved.
All right, thank you so much for these insights.
Thanks for you, and this is already it from our side for this first part. So many thanks for your attention, and now back to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Regula and Dominic. That was very insightful. I don't see questions in the chat yet, so I propose that we directly go to Serena from Dormacaba, Serena Alonso. She will talk about Dormacaba's approach to children's rights and illustrate what has been said also just now. So Serena, we see that you are now sharing your screen. So Serena, the floor is yours.
Hi, do you see my screen normal, big and all
Yes,
good?
all good.
Okay, I don't see you, so if anyone has a question, please feel free to write it in the chat or even speak and interrupt me, and I will answer any question if I can. So as Alice was saying, I'm Serena Alonso. I work as a human rights specialist at Dormacaba. And for those of you who may not know the company, we are one of the leading industry companies in smart access solutions globally, and we are present in more than 130 countries and rely on over 15,000 employees. And today, I will talk about 3 different topics. This is, of course, an ongoing process, so we just present to you what we have at the moment, but it will continue to evolve. So first, I will explain Dormacaba's commitment to the fight against child labor, as well as how it was developed. Then I will describe the processes that we have in place currently for identifying child labor risks in both our own operations and the supply chain. And last but not least, I will talk about the different projects that we are implementing to try and complement our due diligence strategy and walk away from a near compliance-based approach. So with regards to our policy commitment, I must say that Dormacaba's commitment to this fight against child labor can be found in many documents. For example, the code of conduct of the company already states a clear prohibition of engaging on child labor. But these 2 that are written here are the most relevant ones. Because the statement of commitment identifies child labor as a salient issue for the company and therefore gives us ground to act upon it. It also commits to follow international standards. And on the other side, the Responsible Labor Directive that acts as the human rights policy of the company translates all the formal commitments into practical measures. And both documents, the statement and the directive, have been signed by the company's top leadership, so the chairman of the board and the CEO respectively. And I must say that this support really helps us in our daily tasks, especially when we try to align with internal stakeholders that may not be as familiarized with the topic as we are. And just a few notes on how the approval process of these documents was carried out. So it required, of course, several rounds of review, and especially what I find it was very important was a thorough communications of the measures that were needed to address this risk, and also the reasons why those specific measures were needed. And then regarding the stakeholder engagement, well, both documents embed the views of over 20 stakeholders, because they were a direct result of the group saliency assessment, which we conducted, by the way, with Focusrite. So yeah, they have the views of internal and external persons, and also experts on business and human rights. Then I would like to briefly show you what our Responsible Labor Directive says about child labor. And as you can see, all Dormakaba sites have strictly prohibited to engage persons under the age of 15. And it's also mandatory to verify the age during the hiring process of any prospective worker, as well as to establish adequate protection for young workers that may be working in our plants. And for those sites that are located in countries that have been identified as high risk for child labor, there are additional requirements, such as cross-checking the ID with another official identity document that can be, for example, a birth certificate, or the establishment of access systems that allow for ID or fingerprint verification, so we can ensure that no one is entering into our premises and without meeting the minimum age. And these requirements are also present in the terms and conditions for labor agents and labor contractors. There is a contractual clause that we have developed to manage the risks that these suppliers pose to human rights, and also with regards to child labor. What I find is an interesting development. And then the Responsible Labor Directive also develops our commitment to remediate the child in an adequate manner. So in the event a child would be found working in Dormakaba premises, the entity would have to at least adopt all the measures that are written in the slide. So the managers would have to schedule a health exam for the child and take appropriate care of any health issue that that exam identifies. Then the child would receive financial support in the completion of the compulsory schooling period. Then the income of the child would be maintained until he or she is legally eligible to work. And where possible, and ideally, the child would be transferred into an apprenticeship position, of course, adapting the hours and tasks to the educational needs. And by means of this process, and why I think it's important to bring this into this fora, is that we want to walk away from the approach of simply discharging the child. Because this may in turn lead the child into even more dangerous and more informal labor settings. So instead, what we try to do is to ensure adequate remediation for the victim and also contribute to his or her development. And these requirements are also contained in the terms and conditions for labor agents and contractors. Then regarding risk identification, so the second part of the presentation, Dormakaba undertook a couple of years ago, as I told you, with Focusrite, a group saliency assessment to identify where in the value chain lay the risks of child labor, as well as of other human rights topics. And since then, we have worked to develop risk management systems for both our own operations and the supply chain, and they follow the ILO requirements. So the saliency assessment indeed identified child labor as one of the company's salient issues, with the risks being mainly circumscribed to the supply chain, in particular the upper tiers of it. And this is explained by the fact that many Dormakaba products contain minerals such as cobalt, whose extraction and processing often involves severe human rights violations, as we are all unfortunately aware of. And the methodology behind this saliency assessment was based on the consultation of more than 20 internal and external stakeholders that delivered a list of potential human rights impacts that could be present in Dormakaba's value chain. And this list was then assessed against the criteria of severity and leverage for identifying those risks that were actually the most salient for the company. And the leverage in this case was measured on the basis of how far from the company's operations were those impacts occurring. And the assessment really helped to galvanize support internally and triggered the developments such as the adoption of the Statement of Commitment or the Responsible Labor Directive. Then coming to our own operations and how we identify and manage the human rights risks, including child labor risks. Of course, this is work in progress, but I present what it stands today. So we are finalizing what we believe is a comprehensive program that involves both internal and external assessments. And the internal assessment is, as of now, based on a questionnaire that we launched this year for the very first time to check the level of implementation of the Responsible Labor Directive throughout Dormakaba sites, including all the points relating to child labor. And all locations, no matter whether they are a plant, an office, an assembly center, were required to answer to this questionnaire. And then once we received all the questionnaires, I engaged on one-to-one meetings with those sites whose answers showed a very low level of implementation of the directive because we needed to know more about their situation and also their needs and what they need from us. And once I had that information, I paired it with public indexes that indicate risks to human rights and child labor per country, and then assigned a social risk score to each site. And then the social risk score has been coupled with other group KPIs. And with that, we have identified those locations that pose the highest risks to human rights. And they will in turn be undergoing a social auditing cycle conducted by an external auditing firm specialized on human rights. And lastly, for particular operating context, we develop ad hoc processes that may involve external or internal assessments. So for example, when we acquire a company, we may perform an off-site assessment to know where it stands and then set out clear guidance on what do they have to do to meet our standards, and then set out an on-site assessment to check whether they have really identified and applied the measures we mandated. Now moving on to the supply chain. At Dormakaba, we perform several supplier assessments in different points of the business relationship. So at the internal level, we are actually developing a pre-onboarding risk assessment for prospective suppliers. That was one of the gaps that existed in our 360 assessment of the supply chain. And it will be based on two steps. Most probably. The first step is an artificial intelligence tool that will scan the internet in searching for human rights scandals, fines, release orders that are linked to a company. And then it will highlight those risks to the procurement team in a digestible manner. And in this way, the procurement personnel can decide whether or not they move forward with this enterprise into an onboarding phase. And then the second step, is an SAP module that we are customizing to try and channel all the suppliers through different logic trees, depending on the risks to human rights they pose. And each logic tree has different steps and different processes that the supplier must meet in order to be qualified as an acceptable supplier from a sustainability perspective. And then once the supplier has walked all those logics and they are onboarded, they will undergo an annual risk assessment made on the basis of country, product, and spend. And this assessment will then deliver a target group of suppliers that we then channel through the EcoVadis off-site assessment. And then for those suppliers that either do not participate on the overall assessment or do not comply with the corrective action plans set by EcoVadis, we perform external on-site, we arrange external on-site assessments, also performed by an external auditing firm. And then I wanted to talk to you about the complementary approaches that we are developing to try and further develop our human rights due diligence and steer it towards something beyond mere compliance with the legislation, as Alice and the UN Global Compact always say. And since the risk of child labor in our value chain are mainly focused on the upstream part of our mineral supply chains, in particular cobalt, and we do not have the visibility or the leverage to act on this area of the supply chain. Some time ago, Dormakaba initiated, hand in hand with Focusrite again, the Cobalt Dialogues. That is a project that aims to create a safe space for our suppliers of cobalt to discuss human rights risks and child labor risks in our joint supply chain, and then invite tier 2 suppliers to join the conversation, and so on and so forth, a progressive effort towards more visibility and joint leverage. And then to assist on this project and also to gain more understanding on the supply chain, we participate by buying cobalt, or better said, cobalt-containing products. Dormakaba commissioned a study to the University of St. Gallen that delivered to us a lot of insights on the supply chain, the tiers, also the actors involved in the upstream part, and also recommendations from experts on what to do and what not to do to address the risks and the severe human rights violations that are happening in this supply chain. And the study, as well as a flyer that contains the main recommendations and the main information, will be publicly accessible, and we will distribute it to the UN Global Compact, the CLP, and to any of you that is interested on it. And then the third project that I find very worth mentioning is our effort to become a living wage employer in all countries where we operate. And we believe that by ensuring adequate salaries, we are actually very much contributing to tackle one of the main root causes of child labor, that is poverty and the incapability of the parents to maintain and finance the household. So with these initiatives, what we try is to, as I said, walk away from a compliance-based approach and bring about meaningful change in global supply chains. And yeah, this is all from my side. So I'm happy to receive any questions now at the end, or via email if you have any.
Thank you very much, Serena. You walked us through all this content very efficiently. Thank you so much. We have a few questions for you. In the sake of time, if I think we will take them, but if you could keep the answers short, that would be great. So first question from Claire, who is checking on the implementation of the commitments that you mentioned? Is there a monitoring process?
Yeah, so what we are now doing to check on the implementation is the off-site assessment from our side. So this has been implemented 5 months ago. And the first step is to know whether the Responsible Labor Directive that contains all the commitments digested into a practical set of actions, whether or not it's being implemented and whether or not there's knowledge about it. And from now, we will continue working on it.
Thank you very much. Then from Murugan, we have a question. If you had cases of child labor in your supply chain, and if yes, did you follow your remediation process?
As of now, our suppliers are not required, apart from the labor agents and contractors, through the contractual clause that is separate from the supplier code of conduct, are not required to follow our remediation process. And since I joined, I haven't found any case of child labor, but if I would find any, I would make sure to try and provide adequate remediation for the child with this process and with other mechanisms if necessary.
Thank you. Then there is one question about your artificial intelligence tools that you use for risk detection. Which one is that?
Yeah, so we are in the process of getting the IQ Plus of EcoBuddies, but there are many service providers on the market, and I assume there will be many more coming thanks to the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act.
Thank you so much. And then last question, will your living wage commitment apply to your suppliers as well?
As of now, no. We are going to first take care of our own operations, but at a later stage, we would definitely try.
Great. Thank you so much, Serena. That was very insightful. Now I will invite Dorothee Baumann-Poli and Berit Knack to share the screen and present why zero tolerance policies don't work. Very happy to have you with us, Doro and Berit. And yes, we see the screen in the right form. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. And we are happy to be part of this event. So the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights is part of the University of Geneva, and it's the first human rights center that's part of a business school in Europe. What we do is we do research and provide training to support businesses in advancing human rights in their corporate practice. So we will present today on why zero tolerance policies don't work. With this conclusion, we are aligned with other organizations that also work on child labor due diligence. And today we'd like to give a short input on why this is the case. We know that child labor has risen on the agenda, especially since the new mandatory human rights due diligence legislation applies since this year. And last year, we conducted a baseline study on children's rights among Swiss and Liechtenstein companies, together with the Center for Children's Rights Studies, also at the University of Geneva. And here you can see the key insights from the study. And what I'd like to highlight is that mitigating child labor was consistently perceived as a key priority for companies. More than 80% of the companies in our study actually mentioned this as a key priority also across industries. Now, on a policy level, the elimination of child labor is clearly the high level or long-term objective. And the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, emphasize the need to prevent the worst forms of child labor and also state the objective to end all forms of child labor by 2025. And these policy objectives are reiterated in national policies, such as, for example, by the current Swiss National Action Plan strategy from 2020 to 2023. Now, how do companies respond to these expectations? How do they deal with child labor? No company wants child labor in their supply chain, and most of them start by codifying this commitment in zero tolerance statements. What you can see here are 3 excerpts from Swiss companies from different industries, and as you can see, all of them mention zero tolerance for child labor. We could have exchanged these examples. They are very common, and in the research that I just mentioned, almost all of the companies that refer to child labor also use zero tolerance language. Not all of these companies have remediation mechanisms in place, and only 20% of those companies who identify child labor as a risk also have additional programs in place, for example, to address root causes. Now, in addition to analyzing the policies, we also spoke with companies in that study, and here we found a more holistic understanding of the relation to child labor. The quotes here show a little bit of a mixed picture, with some companies just starting to communicate with their tier 1 suppliers and stating their zero tolerance expectation to these suppliers, whereas other companies have more elaborate programs in place to work with their suppliers and actually acknowledge the more intricate links between their operations and child labor. So with this, I would like to hand over to Dorothy, who will discuss the problems of relying only on zero tolerance policies.
Thank you, Virit, for setting the scene. So now straight to the title of our presentation, Why Zero Tolerance Policies Don't Work. So our research in other contexts has already highlighted the limitations of zero tolerance policies generally. For example, in Bangladesh, in the garment industry, brands have zero tolerance for unauthorized subcontracting. Or in the cobalt supply chain mentioned just by the previous speaker, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, downstream companies say in their contracts that they do not accept cobalt from small-scale artisanal mines. This, however, does not correspond to the business realities on the ground. A zero-tolerance policy won't make the human rights challenges go away. So, and there's ample empirical evidence for this. Despite zero-tolerance policies, subcontracting in Bangladesh continues. Cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, over 10% comes from artisanal small-scale mines in global production. And the same is true for child labor. Clearly, we are very far from eradicating child labor. And I think, in fact, the zero tolerance policies are part of the problem because they create a number of what we call unintended consequences. First, we believe child labor can become much harder to detect if there is a zero tolerance policy in place because it sets incentives for farmers and suppliers to hide the practice or even falsify documents when there is an audit coming up. It also drives child labor into deeper layers of the supply chain. If there is an audit at tier 1, the children might move to factories in tier 2. And something that we've seen in as well is that children end up working in other more dangerous facilities or sectors. For example, they move from farming to mining simply because they need to support families' livelihoods. And there was a high-profile case that the ILO supported many years ago in Sialkot soccer ball stitching industry, where children were working alongside their families in their homes to help stitch soccer balls. And that was considered child labor, and the ILO engaged in a major project to eradicate that practice. However, years later, those children, because they couldn't work on the soccer balls anymore, were found in other industries that were arguably a lot more dangerous, from mining to tobacco, etc. And I think the last point is very important, because if you have a zero tolerance policy in place, you signal a very limited commitment to actual remediation, to remediate the very complex drivers for child labor, in particular, when those child labor cases then lead to the immediate termination of a contract. And so to us, the problem is that zero tolerance policies can be considered a form of outsourcing responsibility. As companies outsource production, they sometimes also outsource the responsibility for the conditions of production. And if you have a zero tolerance policy in place, it looks like you're outsourcing responsibility, which is not in line with the commitment to conduct human rights due diligence. And so we believe it's a falsely understood approach to pretend compliance. So what can companies do? Next slide, please, Spirit. Of course, they need to spell out the premise, namely the premise is that we live in a world where children don't work. This must be the end goal. But we also need to acknowledge that the socioeconomic realities where production takes place are different and require engagement with what are often very complex drivers for child labor, from understanding poverty and livelihoods to analyzing bureaucratic hurdles such as lacking birth certificates to behavioral changes that are necessary to combat child labor. And beyond engagement, companies' policies should emphasize the commitment to remediation, because only then companies' policies are actually in line with human rights due diligence, the spirit of human rights due diligence. So concretely, how do these insights translate to the formulation of a good child labor policy that sets the right tone and the right approach? So on the next slide, we list concrete suggestions that capture the key elements, the overall vision, the acknowledgement of the problem, and the emphasis on remediation. And this needs to be put into a policy in addition to the diagnostic questions that the first speaker from Focus Rights presented based on the ILO IOE tool. For us, the way forward is of course, that zero tolerance policies to eliminate child labor are well-intentioned, but to counter these unintended consequences, we believe they should be replaced with child labor policies that put the strongest emphasis on actual remediation. So with this, I stop. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to questions. And the next speaker I know will elaborate further on how to draft a good child labor human rights due diligence policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doro. Thank you very much, Berit. That was very inspiring as well. I think it is an extremely important message that you are conveying here. And yeah, I think this is exactly what you said. How do companies now need to do? Because it's obviously the first reaction, right? When you hear, okay, there is child labor, no, we don't want that. So we need to become a bit more articulated and a bit more complex in the way we treat those issues. So thank you very much for that. There is one question. Actually two. So first of all, please, have you made any trial on this approach? Where and what were the results?
That's a question that I find difficult to understand. Which approach? The approach to acknowledge that business realities are as they are, and we're more honest in acknowledging these and working on the problems, or
probably the researching of the root causes and exactly, and the acceptance that the situation is what it is, and then working towards doing that better.
Well, unless we acknowledge the problem, we can't really work on it. So it's a condition for actually a successful approach to work on child labor. If we don't just want to push children into other facilities, other industries, and wish the problem away by contractually excluding that this problem exists at all. So,
but do you have examples where taking this approach of understanding, and so having another approach than a zero tolerance approach, that it had success? So do you have an example? Or
absolutely. I think there are companies that now, rather want to know what's really going on in their supply chain instead of, drafting complex policies that rule out any major issues. And only then they can manage risks. Because if there is an expose of, let's say, a child in a global supply chain attached to a brand, then they have no foundation to actually defend their approach because the children are there. So I think there are examples of companies that actually asked their suppliers to come forward with difficult practices and created a safe space to say, we really want to work with you to build capacity, not only on child labor, on many other issues, like from excessive overtime to discrimination to subcontracting. Some brands now really want to know and understand drafting a policy is not the solution, and they want to help their supply chain partners with actual solutions, and that requires an amnesty, I think, on the sanctions or fines, saying let's sit together and figure out, why do you have excessive overtime continuously? Why are there children working in the supply chain? Once you explore the root causes, it's much easier to actually address the problems in a sustainable way.
We have another question, which I guess you receive a lot as a question. It's if focusing on remediation and thus admit that there will be illegal child labor happening, is it a form of legitimization of child labor? And so are you legitimizing it by doing that?
Thank you, Claire. I think it's a great question. The first element, as we emphasized, needs to be, of course, we do not want to have child labor in our supply chain, but we also acknowledge this happens because we work in contexts where this practice is commonplace. So it's finding the right balance between saying, of course, we work towards eliminating that practice, but we also acknowledge, as we uncover such a case, we need to engage with and understand it and really address it at the core. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think you also just use exactly the words, right? We want to eliminate child labor and not protect the company from being in contact with child labor, right? I mean, we need to change this perspective that child labor needs to disappear, not just only from our supply chain, but from all the supply chains. And if we want to do that, we need to work on it, acknowledging that it's existing.
A last comment, Alice. I feel like the emerging mandatory human rights due diligence legislations compel companies to believe that they need such a zero tolerance policy to be in compliance. And I really think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The spirit of human rights due diligence is to remediate problems as they emerge and not to wish them away. So to be in compliance actually means a commitment to remediation and not avoiding the problems.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Doro and Berit. You will stay with us if there are other questions coming up in the Q&A at the end. Now I will invite Sandra from Save the Children to share her screen and make the presentation. Yes, we see your screen. Perfect. Sandra, Perfect. The floor is yours.
Thank you. A warm welcome also from my side. I'm Sandra Roth from Save the Children Switzerland. I will try to keep my input quite short because we now talked a lot about child labor and child rights policies, but not that much about the risk assessment and impact assessment yet. So to ensure that my colleague Marlene will have some time left, let me try to put it in and squeeze it very quickly. And just give it an extra view on the issue of child rights versus just focusing on child labor. And in order to do so, I would just quickly discuss or mention the purpose of such a policy, because I sometimes think that there's a misunderstanding. It is a public commitment towards children and children's rights. It's not a marketing tool. It's not meant to be written and put on the wall and used to show off towards customers or business partners. It is a legal framework that is used for supplier business relations. It's not a paper tiger. I hope that exists in English as well, the term. So it's not a static document that you just write down and then you put it somewhere and never look at it again. But it describes a living due diligence system that might change over time and that develops. It is an essential part of a legal obligation, so it's not just a nice to have. And from my point of view, it should reflect the diverse impact of business on children and not be limited to the issue of child labor, and definitely not follow a zero tolerance policy. So I'm absolutely in line with my previous speakers on that. And if we think about children's rights, this is an overview of the conventions on the rights of the child. I think it's easy to see and understand that child labor affects many different child rights. It's about education. It's about protection from violence or sexual abuse. It's about the right of children to play and to rest. So it's not about work. So not only about work. So in order to holistically protect children, it's not enough to just prohibit child labor, but to put children's rights into focus. And there are two layers to that. It's on the one hand, the responsibility of companies to respect children's rights and to avoid any infringements and to address any impact and remediate. And the other layer is their commitment to support children's rights by additional actions, could be the core business operations or also advocacy work, philanthropy, in order to promote children's rights. So it says respect and support, both layers, which I think are very important. And what could be a good framework when we think about child rights in business are the children's rights in business principles that you might have come across already or not. They were drafted more than 10 years ago by the Global Compact, UNICEF, and Save the Children. It is a comprehensive framework to understand and address what impact businesses have on children's rights. So they do include necessary actions to prevent and eliminate child labor, but they are broader than that. And they highlight the diversity of ways in which businesses can affect children. And by integrating these principles and supporting children's rights, it can help to strengthen your existing corporate sustainability initiatives and ensure benefits for your business. So to put essentials of a holistic policy just in a quick nutshell, and some points we did already address because they are also written down in the guidance tool, they were also mentioned by the other speakers, is we need the reference to the applicable laws and regulations. We need a part in which we define what are the different terms, what is child labor, what is considered hazardous work, what are young workers, to make sure that there's the same understanding throughout the whole company. It needs to include a description of what is your business model and how does your supply chain look like, because it might be very different from other companies. It needs to define what expectations do you have to the other organizations directly being linked to your business, suppliers, customers, your own employees. It should include, or it does need to include, your description of your due diligence system, however it looks like. So what processes do you have in place? And in the next webinar, we will give more insight on what might be potential measures to seize, prevent, and mitigate child labor risk. Commitment to remediation. Again, I strengthen the argument of Dorothy on that. So what happens to those child rights violations happening today and tomorrow and the next week, and how can we support these children? A grievance mechanism, another topic that we will address in the upcoming webinars. And there are also some formal things to keep in mind. It needs to be updated. It's a living document. It needs to be publicly available, communicated in and externally. It needs to be signed off by the top management representative. So there are quite a lot of must-haves or essential in order to ensure a holistic policy. And for those eager to start drafting it or enhancing their existing policies, there are quite a lot of tools and guidelines available online. So I just put together some links to invite you to have a look into it and see whether there are some aspects and things that you might want to include in your policy writing. And with that, I hand over back to Alice. Thanks a lot for listening, and I look forward to the upcoming webinars to go more into detail on that specific measures and tools.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you so much. And for the sake of time, yes, we will directly go to Marlin and invite you to share your screen.
Okay, it seems that it's working, right?
For now, it's not in the slideshow mode. Now, yes. Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Malin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alice, for inviting us, the Center for Child Rights in Business. We will be joining you for all 4 sessions on different topics. So very exciting. And I'm also very happy to hear the conversation so far and that we have talked so much about remediation, which I think is a topic that is very often overlooked. And we will not focus on, or I will not focus on remediation here in this presentation, but I just would like to mention that last year, only last year, the Center for Child Rights in Business remediated more than 300 cases of child labor in different supply chains across the globe, mainly in Asia. So if you want to know more about how these remediation processes work, just let us know. And I know that this will also be for another session. But just to mention that remediation happens, it works, it gives the children a better situation, and it also helps the company to adjust whatever processes and policies that they need to strengthen to avoid this to happen again. Okay, anyhow, the Center for Child Rights in Business, we are a child rights organization focusing on supporting companies. We work directly with businesses in global supply chains across the world. We are owned by Save the Children Sweden. I've been with the Center for 10 years and currently I'm based in New York. All right, we're going to talk about the Child Rights Impact Assessment. That's something that we have been doing for a couple of years at the center. And I think last session, my CEO shared also some key results from the new study that we launched a couple of weeks ago, where we look at 20 out of the many child rights impact assessments that we have been doing, and where we could see that out of these 20, we found child labor directly, what we saw in 10 of them. In other 8 of the impact assessments out of the 20, we saw that there was a high risk for child labor. So only 2 out of the 20 didn't indicate either kids on the ground or risk for child labor. So a child rights impact assessment is quite effective in identifying risks that are linked to a number of child rights issues, but also, of course, on child labor. And a child rights impact assessment, the CRIA, we have some of the previous speakers have talked about this. I will also focus a little bit more later on in my presentation how this really looks on the ground, but it takes a deep dive into key sourcing locations. This is decided with the brand. Where are we going to do the assessment? It's always happening on the ground. You can see my colleague here. She is in cacao fields in Indonesia, talking to a farmer. And the aim is to provide a comprehensive understanding of where business operations have a direct and indirect impact on children and their parents as workers. So the focus of the Child Rights Impact Assessment is really tailor-made based on the specific risks that we can see in the selected area, in the selected commodity and the selected supply chain. So this is a very thorough discussion that we are having with the clients. It's not sort of one size fits all. We do have sort of tools and methodologies for this, but it needs to be contextualized. And we are not looking only into child labor, and also as Sandra talked about before, there are a lot of things that are included in child rights, but we also look at the broader human rights issues, perhaps focusing also on forced labor, human trafficking, if that is a risk in that particular area, in that particular supply chain. Working conditions, gender equality and discrimination, because these are all issues that are linked to child rights risks, and of course, vulnerable group. We know that child labor is common in sort of migrant communities. So that's something that we look at. Where are these migrants coming? What rights do they have? Are they international migrants? Are they domestic migrants, and so forth? And then when we have done our on-the-ground work, we provide businesses with a report, which is short and concise, hopefully, and we provide you with concrete recommendations on what to do next. So this is an overview. This is sort of the whole flow of an assessment, and we start with the risk mapping and desk research, which I think also links very nicely with what Focusrite presented on the ILO and IOE guidelines. So we do a mapping of your supply chain, which can reveal some very interesting information. We had one done in India, where the brand thought that their first-tier supplier had 10 subcontractors, and I think that we identified over 100. So supply chain mapping is, of course, super important because we know that child labor and child rights risks are very often happening in the lower tiers. We do contextualize, as I mentioned, our tools, which includes everything from surveys that are done on cell phones or iPads to interviews one-on-one, to focus group discussions, to participatory exercises with kids. Then we go to the site, we do a thorough walkthrough, and I think that is really one of our strengths. And we visit subcontractors, and on the spot, we also review various policy documents that we haven't received beforehand. We do work with a number of, and we collect data from a number of stakeholders, and that is one of the key differences, I think, from a social audit. That here we not only talk to the ones that are on site, on the pepper farm, or in the manufacturing facility, we talk also to the school teachers. Do they see any sort of, are there any times during the school year when the kids are more absent, for example, in agricultural communities? Is that during the harvesting season? Is it during the seeding season? We talk to community actors, we talk to churches, we talk to NGOs in the region, just so we can also assess the risks. So it's not only what we see here and now, which I mentioned in 10 out of these 20 that we did, we saw directly on the ground, but what is sort of relevant for you, for brands, is to know what are the risks. We look, of course, we do our analysis, and which is linked to similar sort of analysis and explanation of risks, as Dormakaba showed in their sort of diagram. We do the similar ones, the likelihood of violations and the significance of the risks, if they are severe, medium or minor, and what this means for your company. And then we, as I mentioned, we present the report. So what is the difference from a social audit? That's a question that we often see. So for example, you see these kids here, they have all been part of impact assessments, and those you wouldn't see in a social audit, I hope, because that means that they are there working. So the kids here are at a school, at a community centers, or in the local communities. And we ask them, for example, to do some fun exercises, the Wheel of Life, for example. That's what the girls are doing up there, describing how do they feel, what do they do during one day, do they work, do they go to school, what are their aspirations for life, and so forth. And then we also work with the kids, the boys that you see in the lower picture there. They are describing sort of how a day in their life look, where they go to school, when they go to the fields. So we can't just ask kids, so are you working? We need to find out, many of them know that they shouldn't be working, so we need to find out in other ways. When are they working? What kind of work are they doing? Where is this always happening? Do they go to school? Do they skip school? And so forth. And here I think this is one of our sort of strongest skills, that we know how to talk to the kids. And I also mentioned that we use various techniques and that we talk to different stakeholders. And what we also do is that we are reviewing the purchasing practices, the business practices, and how this is impacting children and workers. So I think that is also one key difference. And we assess, as I mentioned a couple of times before, we addresses the risks and the likelihood of risks. Are there risks for child rights violations here due to perhaps purchasing practices? The farmers tell us they have too little income, they can't pay the school fees or the uniforms. So that means, even though they might not say it out there, that they have to have the kids working, but we can see when we do our analysis that, okay, these families don't have enough money, they don't earn enough to pay the related school fees. Or they say that they can't pay for hospital visits with their income. Then we know that this is a risk. These are risk factors. Income, of course, is a risk factor. Migration is a risk factor. Quality of education is a risk factor, and a number of other things. And then, of course, we are a child rights organization, right? So our focus is children's rights, but we also know, okay, what can companies do? What is in their sphere of influence, right? Businesses have a big impact on workers' and families' life, but what is it that they directly can address that is linked to the purchasing practices? what do you do after a child rights impact assessment? I know that this is also going to be discussed in the next session, but I also wanted to showcase a little bit what you do when you have received the report, because we then provide concrete recommendations, which is again in the sphere of influence of the business. It's linked to your business operations. It's linked to the way that you are working and the kind of work that you are doing. So we usually don't recommend to provide a big support or a big grant to the Ministry of Education through an organization country. We suggest that they work in the communities where they operate. For example, providing community facilitators. This is really in the low tiers of agricultural supply chains, with training on child labor prevention and remediation, as you see in the first picture. They are now studying a booklet, which is very easy to understand, even for those that are not so, don't have the right reading, very high reading and reading skills. They are then trained to become experts in child labor prevention and also remediation when this happens. They work together with a number of actors in the local communities and the brands and the agricultural extension officers and school teachers on these issues. We see that youth, hazardous work for young workers is one of the key challenges that we see in many supply chains. Creating youth development programs where youth are being provided with decent work, specific workstations, specific tasks where they can work without sort of violating their rights, which also include, of course, trainings for factory managers, agricultural extension officers on how they can support juvenile workers. Because we know that if they are above the minimum age for work and they have dropped out of school or don't continue with higher education, then they want to work. So our role is then to put them into decent work and not sort of say that they are not welcome to work because we are just scared that we are not doing the right thing. Setting up childcare centers. This is just a fantastic new one, which was just opened 2 weeks ago in a very remote community in the jungle in Indonesia, I would say, in raw material supply chain, where we had done a child rights impact assessment. And we saw that there was no childcare available. Kids were brought to the workplace where the mothers and dads were harvesting rattan, and they very often helped out. This is a dangerous task they should not be doing. So low threshold childcare center where local community actors and members have been trained to take care of the kids. So it's not a big, huge project, but for now, this is enough for this local community, and we see this as a pilot, and this is something that we're going to replicate in many locations where there is no childcare available, because we see that as also a big risk. Okay, I think I'll stop here because I could talk forever, of course, on this, but I know that there might be some questions and we only have 10 minutes left. So over to you, Alice. See if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Malin. I don't see any question in the chat. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I would have a question, and that would be if a company wants to do that themselves, so they want to do an impact assessment for one of their suppliers or one of the region where they supply, what would be your recommendation? How should they start?
Yeah, so they should definitely start with the mapping of their supply chain, and that needs some detective skills. Usually, it of course depends on the supply chain, but as I mentioned, we have seen huge sort of chains of subcontracting, unauthorized subcontracting. So that, but then your suppliers would most likely tell you that no, we don't subcontract because that's what they are supposed to not do. So map your supply chain, read reports about that region. There are a number of good sources out there. So if I'm sourcing from this particular region or from this particular country, if it's high poverty, weak education system, a lot of migrants, then that means that there is a risk, probably for child rights violations, possibly also for child labor. So know where you're sourcing from, what the risks are. Look at your supply chain, do a mapping, see where are the issues, where do you think it's not sort of the ends doesn't meet up, and then decide what you want to do. What do you want to focus on? who do you want to talk to? Can you do it by yourself, or do you need to assign? You said that if they want to do this by themselves, there are the tools out there for assessments, yeah, or come to another organization that can help you on this, of course.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, it is probably, it needs some training, right, to go into the field and speak with the people to understand what the impacts are on the ground. But I think some companies absolutely know their suppliers and have people also maybe in the procurement teams who know the suppliers or know the situations, and probably also training those people that are very much in contact with the suppliers would be also helpful. And but definitely not an easy task to do. We understand from your presentation. Does anyone has another question? Also from the speakers, Doro, Berit, Sandra, Regula. If you want to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah,
Sandra.
if I can also jump in with a question.
Regula, yes.
You first, Sandra.
Okay, now I was just wondering, Marlene or Alice, I agree it needs a bit of expertise to really go on the ground and identify the risk. But I'm sure what we can do is offer maybe a short list of public sources for this very first high level, getting an overview of what might be the risky sectors, risky countries, risky areas when it comes to human rights and child rights violations. So when we share the slides of that today's webinar, happy to add some links to public resources, maybe as a first step for companies to get an idea of where the major risk might be.
Great, good idea. Thanks.
If I may, Alice, I want to back up Marlene on one thing she mentioned, but I want to emphasize further because it also corresponds to research insights we have, is the fact that brands often don't see the connection between their own purchasing practices and the child labor risks. Often the way how brands source from a specific entity creates economic incentives for suppliers or farmers to cut corner or to be particularly stressed or to just get the job done, and sometimes using their own families or children. So understanding the connection between purchasing practices and human rights risk in the supply chain, we've seen that in multiple contexts, and I think it's very important that in a risk assessment, companies pay close attention to their own business practices and how these create incentives for human rights risks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Oh, sorry, Marlene. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to I mean, agree there with Dorothy that this is key, I think, for companies. And I think it's also very much linked to what you talked about, the zero tolerance, acknowledging that there are risks, that there is a challenge. And I know that child labor is something that all companies fear, that they are going to be in the press saying that, oh, they have child labor in the supply chain, because this can be extremely damaging for their brand reputation and so forth. But we also know that child labor is out there, and you can have the best policies and practices in place, and you can be a nice company, but still kids can be working in your supply chain. And it's not necessarily your fault, but there are a number of root causes to this, and we can help you weed those out, but also acknowledging that you have a responsibility as you are sort of the provider of employment and income for these families. And we know that child labor is very closely linked to families' income. So acknowledging that and not always push back and say, no, it's not us. We don't have child labor. We don't have child labor. I would say, don't ever say that, because you never know what will happen tomorrow. I mean, unfortunately, we still have child labor everywhere in the world. I'm in the US, right? Who thought that I would be working, which we are going to do now, child labor in the US? Well, it's same issues. It's aggressive pricing, excessive use of labor agents, unauthorized subcontracting, migrant kids that are working. Same issues that we see in Turkey, that we see in Uganda, that we see in Indonesia, and so forth. Same issues across the globe. So don't sort of come in with false expectations that this doesn't really happen to me, or this is not my problem.
And if I may add, if companies are concerned about reputation, with a zero tolerance policy, actually they set themselves up for a difficult reputational management situation if child labor is detected. Because then, a journalist could say, well, but you said you have zero tolerance and here's a child. If you actually put out there that, of course, you worked with others and you work on eliminating child labor, but as, a case occurs, you remediate. It's a very different situation. You can then immediately pick it up and say, well, yeah, now we will remediate. And now the remediation strategy kicks in. So I think you're in a better place to actually not put out a zero tolerance policy if reputation management is important to you.
That shows that you are a responsible business, I think, to acknowledge that there are challenges that we are all facing.
Thank you so much. Before I give you the word to Regula, I just wanted to say we should absolutely take again the question of purchasing practices for the next webinar. So for the audience, just be aware that we will touch upon that also in the next webinar, because I think, as you all said, this is really key and too often overseen by the companies. And yes, now I want to give the word to Regula and then Serena.
Yeah, so I have two small additional questions for Malin. The one is companies are, of course, at different levels of maturity in their in how far they are with implementing human rights due diligence. So which level of maturity of companies are you typically working with when you do these type of child rights impact assessments? And maybe in case this is something you do more with a bit more advanced companies, which would be the methodologies or approaches that you recommend for companies that are maybe a bit more at the beginning of due diligence? And then the other question is with regards to small companies or companies that are maybe not ready to do this impact assessment just for themselves, is where do you see the kind of potential for sectoral approaches? So for example, to collaborate through a business association that is from the same sector and kind of do such an assessment together as a sector.
Okay, let me answer the last question first. So in some of these assessments, we have worked with business associations, actually. So we have done pepper, for example, for Association of Pepper Buyers. We have done child rights impact assessment in natural stone in Vietnam, which is together with True Stone, which is organizing stone companies in Belgium, the Netherlands, and the UK. And all of them are very small, especially in the stone sector, except for one or two. They are family-owned businesses, 3 people sourcing stone from Vietnam. So they have come together under one umbrella and do this risk assessment. Same with the pepper. So that's definitely possible. It really works. Then sort of the maturity. Yes, very often, of course, we work with companies that are quite mature, and they have done a lot of work on human rights due diligence. They want to focus on child rights. But we also see an uptake in this by all sorts of companies, given the new legislative environment in Europe. So we also have companies that don't have any policies really in place, but they want to start with this. Very often we work with those that already have the policies and that they have identified some risks, but sometimes we start from the other angle, where they don't have any policies and they don't have really much in place, but they really want to know. They want to do a rapid assessment, they want to do a hotspot analysis, or they want to do a full child rights impact assessment. So we can always tailor make that to companies' needs. So I would say that given the new legislative framework, we see a much broader sort of a variety of companies coming to us, asking us for support. So again, I think everyone is feeling that they need to know more about their supply chain. And if they do a proper human rights impact assessment, which sometimes then feels a bit overwhelming. So sometimes they feel, okay, let's focus on children's rights then. That's perhaps more tangible. Or we are a company that are producing products for kids, for example. We need to know, first of all, that the kids, do we have any child rights risks in our supply chain, because we are selling products that are aimed for kids. So did I miss something, Regula?
Perfect, thank you.
I would quickly hand over to Serena, since we are actually finished with the time for the webinar. I mean, if you can stay, that's really nice. The ones of you who have to leave, thank you so much for being with us today, and hope to see you in the next webinar. And we have a question in the chat. We will make sure, Margot, if you have to leave, that we will answer to your question per email. And if you're still here, we can discuss it. And I'll, Serena, if you want now, you can ask a question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that, for example, when undertaking a social audit, of course, it cannot give you all the insights you need, but you can, like, especially if you contract with specialized auditing firms, they can also undertake a root cause analysis for you and deliver tailored corrective action plans, and then check again whether those actions have been implemented. That's what we are doing at the moment. So the root causes can also be assessed that way, even if it's just not such an in-depth assessment, but it's a start.
Thank you very much, Serena. Is Marco still here?
Yes, I am.
Yes,
Would be
okay.
happy to get an answer.
Great.
I can stay.
Yes, great. So I think we can ask that to Marlin, since you spoke about childcare facilities. If you could, so the question is regarding childcare facilities, any norms or regulations about how to implement them, number of student, type of building, management, resources, etc.
Yes, definitely. I mean, we all know that in Bangladesh, for example, there is a legal provision that facilities with over, I think, 500 workers need to have a childcare center in the building, for example. So that is the legislation, which then doesn't say much more what kind of childcare center this should be, what is the quality, where is it located, and so forth. So there are regulations, but for this one, as you see in the Indonesian jungle, we follow UNICEF and Save the Children's sort of guidelines for early childhood development, or for all the kids. So we do, and we also follow local legislations, for example, for all the child-friendly spaces that we have established in China. So yes, we do follow local legislations, but we also want to stress that there are always opportunities to do sort of small scale, like we have done here in Indonesia, and what we did temporarily in the rose sector in Turkey during the summer, when it was absolutely horrendous conditions for the kids. This is not in Turkey, it was not a long-term solution. So it goes against all sort of best practices, that it has to be sustainable and it has to, certain practices and blah, blah. But it gave the kids there a relief that was working 12 hours a day on the rose field in the sun, terrible conditions. Then the parents wanted them to continue working, but at least we could convince them that they could stay at this facility, the little camp, childcare center for youth, a couple of hours per day at least, to relax, to have fun, to learn some new skills. We talked about a number of issues. There was a proper toilet there where they could also wash their hands, which was not there. So I think we are quite sort of innovative when it comes to finding solutions that fits that supply chain, that community, and is in line with best practices and local regulations. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. Actually, was wondering if there was something, because in some context, depending on the area, it's not always easy to build something that lasts. So we were exploring a lot of possibilities. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and just let me know, Margot. We have some guidance on this and some ideas, and it all depends, of course, on the location. But for example, out of the more of 100 child-friendly spaces that we have set up in China, I think more than 90 of them are continuing year after year without any external involvement. So we have trained factory managers, local staff on running these childcare centers during the summer. They are now doing that independently, and it works really well.
Would be happy to get in touch about that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone. That were really insightful and really interesting discussions. I think, yes, we are a little bit over time. So it is time to close. And so a really big thank you to all the involved persons in this meeting, so the audience as well as the speakers. And very much looking forward to seeing you all in the next session. And yes, have a nice afternoon or day wherever you are. Goodbye.